Old buildings are more than just brick and mortar, because they served a historical purpose that tells us something fascinating about where we came from. Eastern Penitentiary gives us insight into the evolution of criminal punishment in America. It's a standing physical record of how society went from the brutal approach of physically lashing people to the more humane one of locking them up. If you can call it humane, we'll see the levels of isolation prisoners were subjected to at Eastern Penn. It's a legend in the architecture and social planning world. The story of Eastern State shows us how our notions of prisons have changed since the 1700s. In order to understand just how radical Eastern State was when it was first created, we need to understand what the system for prisons was beforehand. So in the late 1700s, punishments, they were all about floggings and whippings and corporal punishment. Right after the American Revolution, the prison institution underwent a radical change, influenced by the humanistic principles of the Enlightenment that were new at the time. Before the 1700s, prisons were just giant holding pens where they tossed everyone in, from murderers to petty thieves, the young and the old. Guards frequently and without consequence abused prisoners, and that wasn't a bug, that was a feature to the system because physical violence was supposed to be a part of the punishment. In the 1800s, a group of powerful people from Philadelphia, they looked at this system and they thought it was antiquated. They wanted to reform the prison system, so they started the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. Dr. Benjamin Rush was in that group. He was actually one of America's founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence. And he wanted to replace what he saw as an overcrowded, corrupt prison system in favor of a solitary confinement one. Benjamin Rush proposed the idea that was radical for the time. He wanted to build the state penitentiary. He saw long-term imprisonment as the most humane and effective form of punishment. You have to remember the most popular prison system at the time was the Auburn System, also known as the New York System, which had prisoners doing forced work together in silence and subjected to physical punishment all the time. No government had ever carried out a program quite like this before. Once they convinced the Pennsylvania government to create Eastern Penn, they had two designers to choose between. There was the English Haviland with his hub and spoke design, and Strickland, who had an octagon building prison. Haviland was inspired by all the prisons that he had studied that were built in the 1780s in England and Ireland. The commission chose Haviland's design, but gave Strickland the job of supervising the construction. It wasn't chosen or designed based on aesthetics. It was for practical purposes. They gave the exterior a neo-Gothic appearance to instill a visual kind of fear into people who would ever think about committing a crime. The interior, on the other hand, looked like the inside of a church with tall arched windows, which ties into the massive religious influence, not just on the design of the building, but the philosophy of the daily routine of forced labor while being in complete isolation. Haviland wrote about how Strickland's octagon wasn't a good approach because it couldn't be expanded in the future if you wanted to add more prisoners, and the ventilation wouldn't work that well. The reason this design was ingenious was because by making each cell block radiate off from that central headquarters, it made it so that the center could be the watch house. In the watch house, the guards could from that single point observe all the different blocks. They had a clear view down each cell block. The octagon security station in the center was the heart of the building where all the security guards were. Each block was an extremity off of it. That way, everything revolved around the guards and their constant surveillance. They could walk around the central platform and see into every yard and detect any prisoner trying to do anything inappropriate. The design became known as the hub and spoke plan. Each of the corridors were attached to 7 single-story cell blocks, and each of them had a similar sized exercise yard. The cells were lit by a single light source from the sky called the Eye of God. The doors, they're kind of odd when you look at them. They're very small, and the reason they made it small was so that it was difficult for them to get out and attack the guards, and it also made the prisoners bow to God as they entered the cell. None of the prisoners were ever allowed to communicate with each other or the guards. As you can see, the intention was for this to be a more humane punishment, but depriving people of contact, even criminals, that could be seen as a worse form of punishment that they actually created. But as we'll see later on, even Eastern State Penitentiary wasn't immune to breakout escape attempts. So they went through the trouble of putting bags over the inmates' heads so that they could never see the true design and layout of the building if they planned to escape. The prisoners were all isolated from each other and the guards. This idea came from the Quaker philosophy of isolation instead of violence as a means of humane punishment. So the influence of Eastern State Penitentiary traces its roots all the way back to at least 1682, when the Quaker William Penn founded the state of Pennsylvania. But this solitude took a heavy toll on the prisoners, as you can see from the following quote from an inmate, John King, who was imprisoned there in the 1800s for 4 years for murder. He said, quote, "This summer a cricket entered my yard. It looked to me like a companion. If a butterfly or any other animal enters my cell, I never do it any harm." Can you imagine being a prisoner there and you're excited to have a cricket as a friend? It's sad, and it shows how horrible the isolation was on the prisoners. Not to have too much sympathy for a murderer, but a society is kind of judged on how it treats its worst criminals. Indeed, the word penitentiary comes from penitence, which has a religious connotation to it because Quakers believed prisoners should be given space and left alone to reflect on their crimes and ask God for forgiveness, and that's what this whole state prison was designed around. This prison influenced and inspired the creation of over 300 prisons in South America, Europe, Russia, China, and Japan. People went to study Eastern Penn from all over the world. It had become a symbol for the new, modern, humane way of punishing criminals in society. Instead of being vengeful towards the prisoners like guards were in the past, it became more of a professional approach. So unlike most people of the time, Charles Dickens, the famous English writer, believed that the prison was cruel and a horrible way to punish someone. He said, quote, "I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. And because its ghastly signs and tokens are not so palpable to the eye, and it extorts few cries from human ears can hear, therefore I denounce it as a secret punishment in which slumbering humanity is not roused up to stay." One way of punishment is brutally obvious to the eye. You see bruises, cuts, and destruction of a human. And on the other hand, it's harder to see a silent torture of a prisoner's mind. It would be half a century before people would side with Dickens on this. Trying to break out of Eastern Penn was as close to an impossible task as there ever was, but that didn't stop the prisoners from trying. William Sutton was a famous bank robber of the 1900s. Him and 11 other inmates began digging a tunnel to escape. They would need to burrow 100 feet underground to be free. Each night they dumped the sand into the toilet and they flushed it. They put a dummy in the bed, and if the guard asked what all that noise was, William would just say he wasn't feeling good and he would cough to cover it up. It took them a year of digging in that tunnel every night to finally dig out to freedom. All 11 of them ran off to start their new fugitive lives after they went through the tunnel and they burrowed through and they got out the other side. But none of them would escape the long arm of the law. They were all caught not too long after their escape. This wasn't the only controversy to hit Eastern State Penitentiary, though. All of their operations came under question a few times. There were 3 times just in the first 100 years that the prison system was called into legal question. In 1834, 1987, and 1903, prison authorities were taken to be held accountable for accusations against them. Prison management had to answer to legislative committees about its inmates, their physical health and mental health. There was already a huge public debate around whether or not solitary confinement of an inmate caused insanity in a person. Did throwing a person in a cage and never letting them speak to anyone drive someone into such depths of loneliness that they would become insane? And there have been studies since then that suggest it has really bad impacts on the brain. None of the prisoners would speak out against the penitentiary because they were very well aware that they would be returned there after the inquiry. The committee ended up complimenting the prison management and denouncing the judge who questioned their procedures. But by 1913, the practice of separate confinement or solitary would be abolished, and prisoners were given cellmates, and solitary confinement was only used as a form of punishment in prison. But this wasn't out of the kindness of the system's heart. There was an overcrowding problem, so they needed to cram more people together. By the end of World War II, the predominant belief in America was changing yet again. Funny how after every major war they changed their mind. People after World War II, they started to believe that prison was meant to rehabilitate the prisoner instead of making the prisoner simply sit there and reflect on their crime. The idea here was that instead penitentiaries would be correctional facilities. They were there to diagnose the prisoner and then attempt to cure them. By the 1960s, aging facilities like Eastern were seen as dilapidated, and not equipped to handle this new wave of criminal rehabilitation, so it was shut down in 1971. In the 1990s, Fulmer and Kern interviewed inmates from Eastern Penitentiary to investigate if prison really did have a rehabilitation effect or not. One prisoner answered, "Prison does not rehabilitate you. It is up to you." You know, you hear people say, yeah, prison will rehabilitate a guy. That is a lot of crap. You are the guy that has to do it. You are going to decide whether you are going to walk that straight line or go back to the old ways. Another inmate said, quote, "Prison doesn't rehabilitate you. It is a school for two things. Number one, to do the right thing when you get out of there. Number two, come out better than when you went in. Prison gives you time to think about what you did. Man has to change himself." Today, the prison is open for tours, and it's a place in American history that is being kept alive. With the modern questions of what mass incarceration means for our society, the issue of prison reform will likely continue to be debated long into the future. What do you think of the evolution of the American prison system, though? I want to know in the comments below. If you like the video, hit the like button and subscribe. I'm your host, Chris Cappy. Thank you for watching.